the gallery's mockery and the artist's struggles. Introduction of the gallery owner. The contemporary art world was a polished, glittering place of exclusivity, a realm where status was the ultimate currency, and reputation was everything. Gilded frames adorned minimalist white walls, and masterpieces were sold at auction for staggering sums. It was a world where only a select few, with the right connections and pedigree, could thrive. To the artists that had made it, success was measured not by talent alone, but by the right people who acknowledged that talent: curators, critics, gallery owners, and influential collectors. In the heart of this world, nestled on a prestigious corner in the city's art district, stood the gallery of Samuel Stone. The man himself was a living embodiment of the very system he helped perpetuate. Stone was a tall, middle-aged man with a finely groomed beard, dressed in tailored suits that screamed wealth and importance. His reputation as a gallery owner was unmatched, his exhibitions were the talk of the art world, and his opinions shaped the careers of rising artists. To him, art was not just about the brushstrokes or the message, it was a marketable commodity, something to be sold for the highest price possible. Taste, in Samuel Stone's eyes, was about exclusivity, high society, and prestige. Artists who didn't fit this mold were nothing more than amusing distractions. He had built a reputation for dismissing artists who didn't fit the standard of what he considered high art, those who came from rough backgrounds or created works that didn't adhere to the rigid frameworks of classical or modern techniques. He would openly mock abstract art or anything that could be deemed chaotic. For him, success meant being known, being associated with the right people, and owning pieces that others would envy. For Samuel Stone, art was a status symbol, not a platform for expression or revolution. Despite his outward smugness, Samuel Stone was a businessman first and foremost. He maintained an impeccable facade of cultured elegance but knew the power of image and wealth. To him, his gallery wasn't just a place to admire art, it was an institution, and he was its king. He had built his empire through exclusivity and curation, always handpicking which artist would make it into the limelight. But on this particular morning, Samuel Stone was in his office, reviewing his next exhibition, when a knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Little did he know, this knock would mark the beginning of a change he hadn't expected. Introduction of the artist. Jamal Turner was a man caught between two worlds. At 32, he had spent most of his life navigating the struggle of living in a tough neighborhood while trying to establish himself as an artist in a world that often rejected him. The eldest son of a single mother, Jamal had learned early that survival was about resilience. His family lived in the heart of the city, in a neighborhood overshadowed by crime and poverty, but Jamal had always seen something beautiful in the chaos that surrounded him. It was in the harsh realities of the streets, the jumbled colors of graffiti, the frenetic energy of the city, the clash of metal and stone, that Jamal first found his voice. He was a self-taught artist. He hadn't gone to art school, and in fact, he hadn't been able to afford the luxury of formal training. Instead, he had spent years honing his craft by studying the works of famous artists and observing the raw, unrefined art that spoke to him from the corners of the world around him. Jamal's work was abstract, chaotic, and bold, painting with a rawness that was unfamiliar to many in the elite art circles. His art was a reflection of his experience, a world built on struggle, strength, and the unpredictable beauty that could emerge from chaos. But no one seemed to care about that. His works were dismissed as unfinished and unrefined by critics who saw only the mess and not the message. For Jamal, every painting was an act of defiance, a reclamation of space, a statement that beauty could emerge from the harshest of environments. Yet, in the art world, these ideas were often deemed primitive or disjointed, pigeonholed into a category of art that wasn't seen as worthy of high-profile exhibitions. He had faced rejection after rejection, financial struggle after financial struggle, yet still, he painted. Jamal's desire to break through the closed doors of the art world had only grown with time. But with every attempt, the doors remained closed. His work didn't sell. His name didn't resonate. The high-class gallery world wanted nothing to do with him, no matter how much he longed for his art to be seen by a larger audience. The truth was, Jamal was beginning to lose hope. the bills piled up. His studio, a small, dimly lit apartment, was the only place where he could breathe. He had poured his soul into every stroke of his brush, only to have his creations fall into the abyss of neglect and apathy. Still, there was a fire in him, a deep belief that he could find someone, anyone, who would see the beauty in his work. He just needed the right opportunity. One afternoon, while walking through the city, Jamal spotted a poster advertising a private exhibition at Samuel Stone's gallery. The names on the flyer were of artists who had become legends in the art world, names that Jamal had heard of in whispers. He didn't belong in this world, but for the first time in months, Jamal felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this was the opportunity he had been waiting for, the chance to prove himself. With a determined heart, Jamal prepared his portfolio. He gathered his best work, the paintings that reflected his soul, and took them with him. He knew he was up against the odds. He knew that the wealthy elite of the art world often dismissed people like him. But he couldn't let that stop him. He had to try. The encounter. The gallery was everything Jamal had imagined, a pristine white space, filled with works of sleek elegance and polished perfection. The visitors, elegantly dressed in the finest suits and dresses, moved like silhouettes through the rooms, admiring the art as if it were a precious commodity to be bought and owned. Jamal felt out of place. He was wearing his best, but his clothes couldn't mask the roughness of his upbringing, the grit that was part of his identity. His hands were stained with the remnants of his latest painting, his shoes scuffed from the long walk across town. As he walked through the entrance, the high-end gallery staff gave him a polite, but wary, glance. He was, after all, just another unknown artist hoping to make a name. Samuel Stone himself was in the back office, but the moment he stepped out, his cold, calculating eyes immediately focused on Jamal. The gallery owner didn't know who this man was, but he could tell that Jamal was different from the people who usually came to him with portfolios. He had an air of defiance, of unrefined energy that rubbed against the polished walls of his gallery. "So, what do we have here?" Samuel asked with a tone that barely masked his condescension. He didn't even bother to invite Jamal to sit down. The artist opened his portfolio slowly, revealing the first of his pieces. It was a painting of jagged lines, vibrant yet disjointed colors, an abstract representation of struggle. The chaos of the city was there, alive on the canvas. Samuel Stone's lips curled into a half-smile, his eyes scanning the work with disdain. "This?" he scoffed. "It looks like a child's tantrum on canvas. I'm afraid this isn't the kind of art that fits in here. You might want to try a more grassroots gallery, perhaps. Something more appropriate for your background." Jamal's heart sank, but he stood tall. He had faced this before. He had been told he wasn't good enough, that his art was too raw, too difficult to understand. But this time, something was different. He wouldn't let Samuel Stone dismiss him so easily. Without a word, Jamal closed his portfolio. He looked Stone in the eye, his gaze unwavering. "You don't get it," he said quietly, but firmly. "You don't see it. But that's your loss. One day, you'll see." He turned and walked out of the gallery, the weight of the encounter heavy on his shoulders. But there was a fire burning inside him. He wasn't done yet. He would find a way to prove them all wrong. The artist's journey and hidden talent. Backstory of the artist. Jamal Turner's life had always been shaped by the hardships of his surroundings. Born and raised in a neighborhood where survival often came down to instinct and grit, he had learned early that nothing in life was handed to you. The streets of his city were littered with broken dreams, and Jamal knew all too well that the odds were stacked against him. His mother, a nurse who worked double shifts to keep food on the table, always tried to shield him from the harsh realities around them. She pushed him to work hard, to be better than the world that tried to define him. It was through her strength that Jamal first learned the power of resilience, the unspoken message that even when the world refused to give you a chance, you could still find a way to rise. Art had been his escape. While his friends were getting involved in petty crime or struggling with their own battles, Jamal would be sitting quietly with a pencil and paper, sketching the images that filled his mind. The first drawings he ever did were of his surroundings, images of cracked pavement, abandoned buildings, and the occasional beautiful sunset over the city skyline. His art was raw, unpolished, and messy, much like the environment that had shaped him. Yet it was within this chaos that Jamal found beauty. He learned that even in a broken world, there was still something worth celebrating. His connection to his heritage was something Jamal wore like a badge of honor. His father, a local poet who had passed away when Jamal was young, had taught him the value of voice, the power of using words to convey the unspoken, to fight against the oppression that seemed ever present in their lives. Jamal's art, like his father's words, was a form of resistance. His paintings weren't just brushstrokes on canvas, they were his way of speaking back to the world that had continuously tried to silence him. He painted the stories of his ancestors, of the struggles of those before him, and of the beauty that could still be found in a world that often overlooked people like him. But breaking through the artistic and societal barriers was no easy task. The art world was notoriously exclusionary, and Jamal, with his unpolished techniques and raw style, had never found a place within it. He faced rejection after rejection, each gallery, each critic, dismissing his work as too rough or too chaotic. He had to fight to even be seen. Yet, despite all the setbacks, Jamal's resolve never faltered. He continued to paint, pouring his soul into each piece, each stroke a testament to his belief that he had something important to say, something worth hearing. He wasn't looking for fame. He wasn't even sure if he wanted to be recognized by the mainstream art world. All Jamal wanted was for people to see his work and understand the depth of the stories he was telling. And if that meant fighting through 1,000 doors that slammed in his face, he was ready. The moment of change. It was a cold evening in early fall when Jamal's life took a sharp turn. He had agreed to participate in an underground exhibition, a small event put together by a group of rebellious artists who rejected the art world's conventions. The event was held in a loft above an old warehouse in the industrial district of the city. The walls were exposed brick, the floor covered in old wooden boards, and the atmosphere was anything but glamorous. The artists were raw, real, and untamed, much like Jamal's work. The crowd was small but passionate, a mix of young art enthusiasts, local curators, and a few independent collectors who valued authenticity over polish. It wasn't the glamorous event that Jamal had imagined he'd one day attend, but in that space, with like-minded artists, he felt alive. The visitors moved from one painting to the next, admiring the bold expressions of pain, joy, and defiance that filled the room. Jamal was proud of his pieces, yet he didn't expect much more than the usual quiet nods and polite praise. He knew his work was still too unrefined, too different for mainstream collectors. But then, something unexpected happened. A man in his late 50s, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, walked into the exhibition. His presence seemed to command the room as he observed the art with a sharp gaze. His name was Victor West, a billionaire investor and art collector known for his unorthodox approach to acquiring works. West was an enigma, a man who had made his fortune in technology and finance but had recently become a passionate supporter of emerging and avant-garde artists. He had a reputation for finding raw, unpolished talent and turning it into something bigger, often uncovering hidden gems before they were even recognized by the mainstream art world. Victor West had been at another event across the city when he heard whispers about this underground exhibition. It wasn't the type of show he typically attended, but he had a gut feeling that he might find something interesting. The first painting he saw was one of Jamal's, an abstract representation of the inner turmoil he had faced growing up, the chaos of his life rendered in swirling reds, blacks, and purples. West stood in front of it for what felt like an eternity, his eyes scanning the piece as though searching for something. For the first time in his life, Jamal felt someone truly seeing him, beyond the paint, beyond the rough edges. West wasn't just looking at a canvas, he was looking at the soul of the artist. "Who did this?" West asked, his voice deep and steady. Jamal, slightly taken aback by the attention, walked over. "That's mine," he replied, his voice almost unsure. Victor West didn't immediately speak, instead studying Jamal's face as if he were evaluating the man as much as the artwork. Then, after a pause, he nodded and smiled. "I see something in this," he said, pointing to the piece. "There's a raw power here, an emotion that cuts through the canvas. This isn't just art. This is a voice, a perspective the world is overlooking." Jamal's heart raced. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. For the first time, someone of real importance had seen the value in his work. "I want to buy this piece," West continued. "And I want to see more of your work. You have a unique perspective. It's something that can't be ignored." Jamal was stunned. He had heard artists dream of such opportunities, but never did he imagine it could happen to him, especially not in this dingy, unassuming space. Yet, as Victor West offered to make the purchase right then and there, Jamal realized that this moment could change everything. The rise. From that night on, everything changed. Victor West became Jamal's first true supporter. He didn't just buy Jamal's work, he introduced him to other collectors, curators, and art lovers who were looking for something fresh, something raw, something real. Jamal's work started to get noticed, not just for its emotional depth, but for its authenticity. People were drawn to his ability to capture raw human emotion, the kind of emotion that resonated deeply with those who had longed for something more than the pristine, polished art that had dominated the scene for years. Jamal began to hold his own exhibitions, small, intimate shows at galleries in obscure corners of the city. Each exhibition brought more attention, word spreading like wildfire about this new, powerful voice in the art world. The underground scene that had once been a place for rebels now began to take notice of the mainstream's desire for something different. Jamal's work was revolutionary, not just because of its raw quality, but because it represented something bigger than art. It was a cultural movement. As his exhibitions gained traction, Jamal was invited to showcase his pieces in more prestigious galleries. At first, he felt out of place, but as his work began to sell for millions of dollars, even the most prominent galleries couldn't ignore him. Critics who had once dismissed his style now wrote glowing reviews, hailing his work as a reflection of the times, a testament to resilience, strength, and the power of self-expression. Jamal's paintings were no longer seen as chaotic or unfinished, they were viewed as masterpieces of emotional depth and power. His paintings became symbols of revolution, of authenticity, and of breaking free from the constraints of the traditional art world. Jamal Turner had gone from being dismissed as a nobody to becoming one of the most sought-after artists of his generation. His work wasn't just art, it was a movement. And the world was beginning to take notice. The transformation of the gallery owner's opinion. Gallery's financial struggles. Samuel Stone had always prided himself on being at the forefront of the art world, an architect of taste and refinement. His gallery was renowned for showcasing the works of the most prestigious and in-demand artists, and the wealthy patrons who filled the gallery's walls paid top dollar to own a piece of history. But as the years wore on, Stone began to feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The world he had cultivated, one of exclusivity, elegance, and elitism, was beginning to feel like a relic of the past. In recent months, the art scene had started to change. New voices were emerging, louder and more assertive than before. These voices weren't the polished, carefully crafted creations of the old masters, no, they were raw, unrefined, and unapologetic. They came from artists who defied tradition, from diverse backgrounds, and from places that had long been ignored by the art world's establishment. And suddenly, these artists were the ones getting all the attention. At first, Samuel had dismissed the shift as a passing trend. The art world will always return to taste and refinement, he would tell himself. True art requires training, sophistication, something these new artists don't have. He'd brushed off critics who warned that his gallery's focus on highbrow, classical works was beginning to feel outdated. He had been in the game too long to let the opinions of a few trendy curators change his approach. But as the months passed, the signs became impossible to ignore. The new artists were everywhere, pushing boundaries, challenging norms, and tapping into a cultural zeitgeist that resonated with a younger, more diverse audience. Art collectors were no longer just looking for the same old, same old. They wanted fresh perspectives. And as this cultural shift accelerated, the financial stability of Samuel Stone's gallery began to erode. The clients who once lined up to buy multimillion-dollar pieces began to disappear. Investors, too, began to look elsewhere, searching for galleries that could offer the next big thing. With mounting pressure from his board and dwindling sales, Samuel found himself in a precarious position. The gallery's reputation was slipping, and he knew it. He couldn't afford to continue relying on the same old roster of artists. The world was moving on, and Samuel Stone was being left behind. He had spent so many years basking in the luxury of his own success that he had neglected the ever-changing landscape of the art world. The truth was, Samuel had become complacent. He hadn't realized how much the art world was evolving, how much the voices of marginalized artists were beginning to take center stage. And as much as he hated to admit it, Samuel knew that if he didn't adapt, his empire would crumble. It was during one of these long, sleepless nights that he first heard about Jamal Turner. The owner learns of the artist's success. The news of Jamal Turner's rapid rise spread like wildfire through the art world. At first, it was just a whisper, a mention here or there, an underground exhibition that had drawn some attention. But soon, Jamal's name was everywhere. His work was being showcased in prestigious galleries, his pieces were selling for millions of dollars, and critics were hailing him as the new face of contemporary art. It wasn't just the success of a single artist, it was a movement. Samuel first heard about Jamal Turner from an old colleague, a curator at one of the city's most respected museums. Over lunch, the conversation turned to the new wave of artists, and Jamal's name came up. "Have you seen the work of Jamal Turner?" the curator asked, his voice filled with a mix of admiration and disbelief. "This guy has completely transformed the art world. His paintings are chaotic, yes, but there's something in them, something powerful. He's tapped into a raw energy that no one else has been able to capture." Samuel, still trying to cling to his old way of thinking, scoffed at the mention of Jamal. Raw energy? Chaotic brushstrokes? That's not art. It's a gimmick, a passing phase. But his colleague wasn't so sure. "You might want to take a look," he said. "He's not a fluke. His work is being collected by billionaires. People are talking about him everywhere. It's going to be hard to ignore much longer." At first, Samuel brushed it off. After all, this was the same kind of talk that had surrounded other trendy artists in the past, artists who had come and gone without leaving a lasting impact. Jamal's success, he thought, was just a fleeting moment, another fad that would eventually fade into obscurity. But as the days passed, Samuel began to hear more about Jamal's success. The artist was getting invited to high-profile exhibitions, his paintings were being sold at astronomical prices, and major collectors were clamoring to add his work to their portfolios. It was clear that Jamal Turner wasn't just a passing trend. He was becoming a force to be reckoned with. The final straw came when Samuel's gallery, once the crown jewel of the art world, saw its first real loss. A major piece from one of his most high-profile artists, an artist he had been working with for years, failed to sell at auction. The wealthy bidders who had once filled the room with their eagerness to purchase art were now noticeably absent. Instead, they were buying works from artists like Jamal Turner, whose name Samuel had once dismissed as unworthy of consideration. The situation was dire. Samuel knew he had to do something drastic, something that would restore his gallery's status and bring the attention back to his brand. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized, if he could sign Jamal Turner, he might be able to salvage what was left of his empire. The owner's change of heart. Desperate to turn things around, Samuel Stone made the decision to approach Jamal Turner. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Jamal had already made it clear that he wasn't interested in traditional galleries. But Samuel was nothing if not persistent. He had built his fortune by taking risks, by identifying trends before anyone else had seen them. And Jamal Turner was a trend he couldn't afford to ignore. He reached out to Jamal through a mutual acquaintance, offering an invitation to meet at the gallery. Samuel promised Jamal an exhibition, an opportunity to show his work in the kind of setting that would elevate his career to new heights. He made it clear that his gallery was the place where artists went to make their mark. This, Samuel assured him, was the next step in Jamal's journey, a chance to join the ranks of the most respected artists in the world. When the two men finally met, Samuel couldn't help but notice the change in Jamal. The artist was no longer the same uncertain, struggling man who had walked into his gallery months earlier. There was a new confidence in his demeanor, a self-assurance that Samuel hadn't expected. Jamal was no longer desperate for recognition. He had found his place in the art world, and he no longer needed Samuel's validation. "I've heard a lot about you," Samuel began, trying to sound authoritative, but the words seemed to fall flat. "Your work has been very impressive. I'd like to offer you a show here at my gallery. A chance to showcase your talent in front of the most influential collectors and critics in the world." Jamal didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Samuel with a cool, calculating gaze. He could tell what was happening. Samuel Stone, the very man who had once dismissed his work as chaotic, was now desperately trying to sign him. He had come to understand something that he had never fully realized before: his worth. He was no longer the desperate artist looking for an opportunity, he was a sought-after talent, and the tables had turned. After a long silence, Jamal leaned forward and spoke with quiet authority. "You didn't see me before. You mocked me, dismissed my work, and thought it wasn't worth anything. Now that I've proven myself, you want to sign me. But I don't need you anymore." Samuel's face reddened. He tried to salvage the situation, but it was too late. Jamal wasn't the same man who had walked into his gallery with a portfolio months ago. He had found his voice, and he wasn't going to let anyone exploit it. Jamal stood up, ready to leave. "You had your chance, Mr. Stone," he said, his tone final. "But now, I'll make my own path." And with that, Jamal turned and walked out of the gallery, leaving Samuel Stone to contemplate the cost of his arrogance. The confrontation and the artist's redemption. The negotiation. Jamal Turner stepped into Samuel Stone's gallery once more, but this time, it was under different circumstances. No longer the uncertain artist hoping for validation, he was now a man whose work had transformed the art world. The air in the gallery felt different too. There was a chill in the polished, white rooms, an undercurrent of tension. Samuel Stone had asked for this meeting, had extended an olive branch, but Jamal knew this was no longer about a simple exhibition. The dynamics had shifted. Now, it was a battle for power. Samuel greeted Jamal with a strained smile, his attempt at a welcoming gesture betraying the anxiety he felt beneath the surface. He had lost a lot of prestige since Jamal's rise to fame, and he was desperately hoping that by signing the artist, he could reclaim some of the influence that had once been his. "Jamal," Samuel said, his voice betraying an edge of formality that seemed out of place given their history. "I'm glad we could finally meet. I've been following your work, and I must admit, it's impressive. You've certainly made quite a name for yourself." Jamal stood in front of him, unflinching, his posture calm but firm. His eyes were sharp, no longer the unsure man who had once hoped for validation. He'd earned the right to control the narrative now. "Impressive?" Jamal said, his tone measured. "You mean you've finally realized that there's something worth seeing in my work?" Samuel's smile faltered slightly. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain composure. "I meant no offense, Jamal. I was merely acknowledging the recognition you've earned. You've certainly proven your talent, and I believe that with the right exposure, we could both benefit greatly from a partnership." Jamal's lips curled into a slight smile, but there was no warmth in it. He knew exactly where this conversation was going. Samuel was trying to downplay his earlier dismissals, those moments of mockery that still stung, no matter how much success Jamal had achieved. "You see, Samuel," Jamal began slowly, his voice calm but unwavering, "you didn't see me before. You mocked my work. You called it chaotic, unfinished, and unrefined. You thought my background was something to be ashamed of, something that disqualified me from your gallery. You thought I wasn't worth your time, your space, or your attention. Samuel shifted uneasily, but he didn't respond. He was trying to steer the conversation back to the positive aspects, to offer Jamal a deal. But Jamal wasn't having it. This wasn't about a deal, it was about respect, power, and autonomy. I've spent my whole life fighting to be seen, Samuel, Jamal continued, his voice now gaining strength. And now, I don't need you or your gallery to validate me. My work speaks for itself. People see the value in it. I see the value in it. And that's what matters. Samuel took a step closer, attempting to regain control of the conversation, but Jamal stood his ground. He wasn't going to let the gallery owner manipulate him this time. Samuel had underestimated him once, but now Jamal was a man who knew his worth, a man who had learned the hard way that his value could never be defined by someone like Samuel Stone. I'm not here to negotiate, Samuel, Jamal said coolly, his eyes locked on Samuel's. You want to sign me, but you don't get to erase the past. You don't get to pretend like you didn't dismiss me, like you didn't try to break me. This isn't about a gallery deal anymore. This is about me taking control of my own path. The silence between them was thick, and Samuel could feel the weight of Jamal's words. He had underestimated this man before, but now he realized just how much he had lost by failing to recognize Jamal's true value. The power dynamics had shifted completely. A strategic move. Jamal stood up from the table where they had been seated, his decision made. He had heard enough from Samuel Stone. The deal Samuel was offering was just another attempt to take advantage of his newfound success, to capitalize on the artist without truly respecting him. But Jamal wasn't interested in being another pawn in the establishment's game. He had come too far, fought too hard, to simply become another star in someone else's gallery. I've made my decision, Jamal said firmly. I'm not signing with you. I'm not working with you. Samuel's face reddened with frustration, his mouth opening to argue, but Jamal cut him off. I'm going to do something different, something you'll never expect, Jamal continued, his tone resolute. I'm opening my own gallery. And I'm bringing in other artists who are like me, who have been overlooked, dismissed, and silenced. We'll create our own space, our own community. We'll show the world that art isn't just for the elite. It's for everyone. Samuel looked stunned, as if Jamal had slapped him. He stammered, trying to regain his composure. But Jamal, you don't understand. The resources, the exposure I can give you, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You can't just walk away from this. I've already walked away, Jamal replied, his voice calm but filled with conviction. I'm building something new, something that doesn't rely on people like you who think they can control everything. You had your chance, Samuel. But now it's my turn. With that, Jamal turned and walked out of the gallery, leaving Samuel Stone alone with the reality that he had failed to see the true value in the artist who had once stood before him. The battle for control was over, and Jamal had won. The power of authenticity. Jamal's decision to open his own gallery was more than just an act of rebellion, it was a declaration of independence. He launched his new gallery with a vision, to showcase the work of artists from underrepresented backgrounds, those whose voices had been silenced by the art world's traditional gatekeepers. Jamal's gallery wasn't just about showcasing art, it was about creating a space for authenticity, for artists to express themselves without the constraints of market-driven expectations or societal pressures. The first exhibition was bold and daring, filled with works that were as raw and unrefined as Jamal's own early pieces. It challenged the conventions of the art world, breaking away from the polished, curated exhibits that had once dominated the scene. The response was overwhelming. People flocked to the gallery, eager to see what Jamal had created, a space where they could witness true artistic expression, a space that celebrated individuality and rejected conformity. Meanwhile, Samuel Stone wasn't about to let Jamal's success go unchecked. Desperate to salvage his own reputation, he began spreading rumors, trying to paint Jamal as a fleeting trend, as nothing more than a product of hype. He tried to discredit the artist, to damage his reputation in an attempt to maintain his own power. But the art world had changed. The very people Samuel had once ignored, the critics, the collectors, the art lovers, rallied behind Jamal. They saw the power of authenticity in his work, and they admired his refusal to be controlled by the establishment. His art wasn't just for the rich elite, it spoke to the struggles of everyday people, to those who had been overlooked, marginalized, and ignored. The media buzzed with praise for Jamal's bold move. His gallery became a cultural phenomenon, with more collectors flocking to see the work of artists who had once been relegated to the margins of the art world. Jamal's name became synonymous with authenticity and revolution, and his work continued to sell for millions, far beyond the reach of Samuel's old gallery. As for Samuel Stone, he watched from the sidelines as the art world shifted away from him. His attempts to discredit Jamal only made the artist more beloved. The new generation of art lovers no longer sought the approval of the old guard, they wanted something real, something that resonated with the world they lived in. And in Jamal Turner, they had found the voice they were searching for. Jamal had proven that authenticity was more powerful than any gallery's pedigree. He had built his own path, and the world was following.